Man is a tragic animal. Not because of his smallness, but because he is too well endowed. Man has longings and spiritual demands that reality cannot fulfill. We have expectations of a just and moral world. Man requires meaning in a meaningless world. Peter Wessel Zapffe. Biography of Peter Wessel Zapffe. Peter Wessel Zapffe, 1899–1990, is widely regarded as Norway's earliest eco-philosopher. He was the first Norwegian thinker to develop a philosophical critique of man's relationship with the environment. Zapffe was not only a philosopher, but also a writer, literary critic, humorist, environmentalist, and alpine climber. He grew up in a rather bourgeois environment in Tromsø in northern Norway. His father, Fritz Zapffe, was known for being a close friend of polar explorer Roald Amundsen. He helped the latter with rations and other kinds of materials for his expeditions up to the polar areas. Peter Wessel Zapfe's childhood was characterized by tough discipline. From early on, this awoke in him a strong aversion against any type of authority. Zapffe climbing at Kolsås. Pressed by his father, Zapffe started studying law in Oslo in the interwar period, 1918–25. During his university studies, he taught himself mountain climbing at Kolsås, a wooded mountain ridge in the municipality of Bærum, close to Norway's capital city. Sparked by their mutual love of climbing activities, he became a lifelong friend of Arne Næss. Famously, when he took his lawyer exam in 1923, he performed one of the tasks completely on rhyme. Zapffe returned to Tromsø in 1925, where he worked for a period as a jurist. In the area around this Nordic city, he successfully carried out more than 21st climbs. Thanks to many literary contributions and humorous drawings, he became a noted member of the Norwegian climbing community. In the 1930s, Zapffe traveled back to Oslo with a keen interest to study comparative literature. His rediscovery of Ibsen's work in drama had motivated him to embark on pursuing a master's degree. The thesis, however, gradually outgrew this format, and historian of literature Fredrik Posch recommended him to rework it into a full doctoral thesis. In the winter of 1940, Zapffe handed in his dissertation, entitled Om det tragisk, on the tragic, for evaluation. With this, he established himself as one of the most original Norwegian philosophers of the 20th century. One of the committee members was Arne Næss. After it had been through a round of drastic shortening, Zapffe would get his degree as Doctor of Philosophy the next autumn. The thesis didn't only spark attention in academic circles, it was eventually published as a book, 1941, and reprinted in several editions. The voluminous philosophical treatise of more than 600 pages has been republished several times but has never been translated into English. Zapfe's eco-philosophical thesis is that humans are the ultimate tragic being, because we have the capacity to realize that the earth would be a better place without us due to the nefarious effects we have on the environment. His central claim is that human beings need a fundamental meaning of life as a whole that transcends other interests. He insists that life is meaningless, since the meaning of life is fundamentally lacking. He asks questions like, why life? What is the point of it all? Zapffe published a 6-page summary of the basic ideas he put forth in his dissertation in Det siste Mesjes, which has been translated into English under the title, The Last Messiah. Zapfe's writings have been compared to those of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. A major influence in the development of Zapfe's thinking was the philosophical pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer. He was interested in what he considered the objective tragedy. Zapfe's essential point is that humans have, contrary to other mammals, a highly evolved consciousness. This is broadly considered to be a positive thing. We have evolved to see meanings and analyze everything around us. There is, however, a backside to our ability to reason and analyze the world around us, according to Zapffe. It has given us the ability to understand what we are ourselves, and what our own role in the cosmos is. A role which seems meaningless in the larger scheme of things. With this ability, we can also see the cruelty of life around us and the basic indifference of the universe. We can see how crude and brutal the force of natural selection is, the force that got us here in the first place. Our ability to see the world this way is at the core deeply tragical, Zapffe held. Nevertheless, he also believed that humans should seek, even demand, meaning and justice. Yet these are not to be found in the world, since the universe is indifferent towards our needs. In his dissertation, Zapffe tried to explore what it means to be a human being. His point of departure was that for humans, the meaning of life is self-realization in the environment at hand. Unlike animals, human beings are not bound by instincts. They are equipped with a consciousness that enables them, among other things, to think abstractly. Through that, humans maintain a less restrained position to the environment they live in. We must presume, Zapffe held, that humans are the only species on Earth with a capacity for self-consideration. We have the ability to reflect on our particular circumstances, and we can assess these in relation to those of other beings. We are not only able to adapt to a given environment, but thanks to our technical remedies we can even survive certain changes in our environment that would mean death for other creatures. Other organisms have abilities that correspond to the challenges that life poses to them: wings to fly with, sharp teeth, fast legs. Humans, however, have eaten from the tree of knowledge and acquired a surplus in consciousness. Obviously, this freedom affords humans more options for self-realization compared to other animals. But these opportunities may be a burden as well. For humans may well aim to give expression to their abilities and talents, both in their free time and at work. There is always the looming possibility of a tragic outcome. To Zapffe, the essence of the human tragedy is that the human being is utterly unsuited to his or her environment. "We are a noble vase in which fate has planted an oak," he once said. In his doctoral dissertation he formulated this insight, which would be leitmotif during his whole life. Zapffe asserted that human beings are overdeveloped in relation to the circumstances under which they live, and therefore fail to fit in with the natural world. Next to Schopenhauer, Zapffe based part of his brand of pessimistic existentialism on the work of Baltic German biologist Jacob Johann von Uexküll, 1864–1944. Each particular organism has its own Umwelt, from the German Umwelt meaning environment or surroundings, Uexküll held, consisting of functional components that represent the organism's model of the world. This pertains to all the meaningful aspects of the world for any particular organism, i.e. water, food, shelter, potential threats, or points of reference for navigation. An organism creates and reshapes its own Umwelt when it interacts with the world. The Umwelt theory states that the mind and the world are inseparable, because it is the mind that interprets the world for the organism. According to philosopher Morten Thomason, this theory constitutes a central ingredient in Zapfe's life work. It is part of the biological outlook on which he built his existentialist eco-philosophy. The year after Zapffe defended his doctoral dissertation, a publication of a completely different kind saw the light, Vet og Vet, Wits and Witless. In the course of time, this book would reach a far wider audience. Vet og Vet is a collection of humorous stories from northern Norway, edited by Zapffe and his friend Einar K.A.A.S. The best-selling book has subsequently been reprinted in several versions and is also put to drama. In the 1930s, Zapffe built a cottage in the mountainous area of Lingen, municipality in Troms County, which he called Jagervan. Ness, who gave him a helping hand in the work, never hid the fact that Zapffe was a major source of philosophical inspiration to him. Zapffe is especially known for his literary descriptions of climbing. In several essays and stories he speaks subtly and humorously of his escapades in nature. Arne Næss once gave the following characterization of Zapffe: "Climbing is as meaningless as life itself," he said, "but it's an excellent distraction." His essay, Steddend, on the mountain with the same name, first appeared in the 1937 yearbook of the Travel Association. The mountain is discussed as a giant, titan, majesty, and horn of hell, an anvil upon which the gods can hammer. After the Second World War, Zapffe, as a freelancer, taught an introductory course in philosophy at the University of Oslo. His publications in the post-war period covered several different topics. We mentioned already mountaineering. But he also wrote on fiction, philosophy, environmentalism, dramaturgy, culture, religion, and politics. Several of Zapfe's essays are collected in the 1969 book Barski Glieder, Rough Joys, among them this essay, Stedend. These selections are regarded today as classics. To the rest of the country, they opened up the world of the mountains of North Norway. Through his writings, Zapffe has united northern Norwegian humor with the clear thought and sharp pen of a thoughtful intellectual. Zapffe cherished his solitude and was skeptical of anything implying the need of formal organization. His first application for membership in the Norwegian Alpine Club was written almost as an anti-application. In it, he spoke ironically and deprecatingly of his climbing activities. The application was rejected. But later, when the club sent him an invitation to join, he thanked for it and said yes. For that matter, mountain climbing isn't a sport at all, Zapffe declared. It is a Dionysian affirmation of life. It is the poor creeping human's encounter with the wrathful skull on the face of the earth. A Dante's journey along the jaws of the inferno, a stroke of arcing life over the silence born of stone. Zapffe was a master of words, writes Dag O. Hessen. His stories about life under the open sky are full of burlesque humor and linguistic elegance. In Barski Glieder he describes a sleeping bag as an artificial fur, which man creeps in to sleep in an otherwise deathly climate. He wished mountains should remain intact, without human intervention. Even the markers for mountain hiking trails, the red T's of the Norwegian Tourist Association, should be taken away. A mountain trip with signs is something completely different from a trip without them. Destruction of nature was treason. His opinions were strongly expressed in several of the book's chapters such as Farewell Norway and Parting with Galster. A characteristic statement of Zapffe is, the mountain won't adapt to humans, but humans are welcome in the mountains. They should just not leave any traces behind them. Zapffe had his own contributions to eco-philosophy. Zapffe was concerned that life in the mountains should be simple, but informative. When he looked across the landscape he was silent. This was not a time for endless chatting, but rather for contemplation. Zapffe has also written several literary works, sometimes with controversial content. During his entire working life Zapffe turned down offers to accept permanent employment. He wanted space and peace to do his own work. Nevertheless, for a number of years he did teach logic at the University of Oslo, preparing students for tests that would be part of their Examen Philosophicum. In 1966 he even published his own textbook in logic, Den Logisk Sandkasse, the sandbox of logic, in which he presented, peppered with his characteristic dry humor, the mysteries of the subject to the uninitiated. Zapffe published several collections of essays, in addition to numerous articles in various journals and newspapers. At the age of 87, he published his last book, Hvordan jeg ble så flink, How I Became So Clever. In the following year, 1987, he received Norway's Fritt Ord, Freedom of Expression, Award. The city of Tromsø honored him by naming a mountain after him. Zapffe died on the 12th of October 1990. The Road, by Peter Wessel Zapffe. An old road came crawling up alongside the river. In its early days it was a fairly small road. In fact, it was borne down in the valley. At the time, it could well be 50 or 60 years ago, when Ivar Steinbreken had put some food in his knapsack and rambled to Langvatnet in search of land, he had to make his way through windfall and screes. But once his place was registered and Ingeborana was convinced, they fetched Rosalind and drove her up along the river. Wherever she went, Ivar put up a marking, because cows, like children, have a good sense of direction. This is how the trail came about, through feet meeting the soft earth. People and trail grew up together, sharing both hardship and hope. When, thanks to the crops of the valley, the first children appeared, and when these stood in front of the priest in the chapel of Langvassli, the trail's childhood had also come to an end. All of a sudden, the young had started to chat about the road, whilst leaving the church and entering the valley in their early youth. Bar diversa even uttered the word carriage to make an impression, and the girls gaped. But the word lingered, and people started to make use of the trail when traveling between the village and the hamlet. Somebody pulled out a root, someone else pushed a rock aside, and a third person chopped off a branch so nobody had to bend over. A carriage arrived, a new one with a door to the side. The carriage was followed by a long wagon, and finally came a carryall. By then, the road started to feel as if she was the queen of the valley, since they all bowed for her and talked about her, holding her dear. "May we have the honor to lead your highness across the scree?" "With pleasure," the road replied, and she went on, carefully traversing the slope, stumbling against the stone wall and birch trunks that were left there, the neat work of some young men. From now on, no one had to jump over branches and stones any longer, and no one had to wade through the water on his socks, with the muck splashing up. It was an embarrassing memory, a recollection of that time when she nearly stumbled down Blaberget Hill. Gracefully and sleepily she proceeded. Under the overhanging leaves, she tiptoed across the old wooden bridge that covered the Crockbeacon stream. With the help of a stick, she crossed the marshes at ease. Only when coming to Vedette she needed to lift her long skirt up so that she could jump from stone to stone. One shouldn't think that her success made her arrogant, for she remembered her first years all too well, the time when she had arrived as a stranger and had begged each and every puddle and stump for permission to proceed. In the course of time she was made to feel welcome by the Langvass River and the Raven marshland, and even by Tyranniden, who at the time was the ruler of all. They had become her soulmates, after all those years they'd spent together, through frost and heat, and through wet and dry. The tiny knots that sometimes appeared were merely a bother to whiners. She never tried to draw too much attention to herself and never tried to stand out above others. She'd rather lay low. Uttering 1,000 apologies, she trod gently and carefully on the twigs that covered Renemra, that old, acidic marshland. At the screes, though, where there was no other way but to interfere, she persuaded the stones that had lived there from time immemorial to move, with the lichen, to the wall of rock, where they would surely feel at home. The timber logs were lying next to the stump, so nobody should complain that no local services were called upon. Only when traversing scanty Geitbird Mountain did she feel shameless and bold, while she hurried across its crest as fast as she could. Each time she came to Tyranniden, majestic and firm as he was, she bowed deeply into the Bregnadalen valley. He had given her permission to pass by, on condition that she would confine herself to the area down by the river. That she did happily, because it was a funny and enjoyable river, fresh, boyish, and full of surprises. And the stories he could tell. Imagine, he was born all the way up under the blue ice. As a child he had played in frightening places, on slippery rocks and along dreadful precipices. At times, he got crushed into bits and had to dive down into dark basins where he could recollect himself. "You would certainly have broken your neck there, my dear wanderer," he said as he chuckled under the overhanging cliff. The road shuddered, full of awe. These were the kind of things she heard while they accompanied each other. Together they went through thick and thin, although they each had their own hurdles. One spring he was at his fiercest and he nearly abused her. He wanted them to get married before they would each go their separate ways. But she got scared and gave him a nice basket made of silver birch. It was inconceivable that she would ever be lonely. Even the flowers, towards whom she had been so unyielding at first, had understood and had forgiven her everything. Now they stood in herds on both sides and in dense beds in between the wool tracks and the bare horse trail, with which they had a tacit agreement. Some fell off, so she always had a choice of summer dresses when she wanted to dress up for her faithful friend, as he plummeted into the Hammergellet Gorge by way of saluting her. One day something happened. A noisy, smelly, and monstrous thing forced its way up through the valley. Inside sat a man smoking a cigar, swearing and spitting, and he kept saying, "Damned road," which certainly didn't make things any better. With 4 nasty, heavy wheels it flattened the flowers on either side. This caused the trail to want to vanish out of utter horror and shame, as just at this time everything was at its height of beauty. "What a delightful, lovely place," the men uttered, when they finally arrived at Langvatnet. "Sure as hell, here I shall place a tourist hotel. Nature's big church, the breath of eternity, yum yum, 400.000. But first we must have a road." The engineers came. Strange men with iron rods and T-squares and eyes of quartz with which they could see the beams. They yelled and they dug, and with a lot of roar and smoke they tore a broad and bleeding sore in the rock, right through the valley. The Ravnamira marshland had to bear thousands of tons, instead of just homegrown branches. Tiranoden was obliterated, and the Bregnedalen Valley disappeared in a landslide. A red-leaded dragon was suspended in the air, across the Langvass River. In a haze of asphalt and dynamite, the new road went berserk, blind and deaf to everything except reaching its final goal. The birches tumbled over and landed with broken limbs on the old trail. She could only help some of the smallest ones in striking root again in the abandoned horse track. The others were only to receive her blessings, whilst they withered away. Iver and Ingeborana clung to using the old one. Up on the rocky plains, where people chased their luck, it was as if their clothes blew off their bodies, as if an unknown dismay was breaking their hearts. They had become frail now. One autumn day, after they had taken a rest under Blaebrigid Hill, Iver again had to put his bag down. At that point they said to each other that this would probably be their last trip. Not many would follow them from their homes. Langvassli was in the grip of progress. Cabins and hotels provided a livelihood to hundreds of people, folks who made sure to pick up whatever the tourists might drop. Visitors came rushing to film a peasant funeral. There were even fewer people to lament the disappearance of the old road, now that it was overgrown by ferns and bushes. Only a small part had remained. It was fenced in when the cemetery was extended to the east of the chapel. Iver and Ingeborana each got their place there. The three of them came to lay next to each other. In the end, the flowers did not know which grave they were to adorn, but that's the way things go. The Last Messiah, by Peter Wessel Zapffe. One night in times long since vanished, man awoke and saw himself. He saw that he was naked under the cosmos, homeless in his own body. Everything opened up before his searching thoughts, wonder upon wonder, terror upon terror, all blossomed in his mind. Then woman awoke, too, and said that it was time to go out and kill something. And man took up his vow, fruit of the union between the soul and the hand, and went out under the stars. But when the animals came to their waterhole, where he out of habit waited for them, he no longer knew the spring of the tiger in his blood, but a great psalm to the brotherhood of suffering shared by all that lives. That day he came home with empty hands, and when they found him again by the rising of the new moon, he sat dead by the waterhole. Two of life, a biological paradox, a monstrosity, and what had happened. A break in the very unity. Absurdity, a hypertrophy of the most catastrophic kind. Nature had aimed too high and outdone itself. A species had been too heavily armed. Its genius made it not only omnipotent over the outer world, but equally dangerous for itself. Its weapon was like a sword without hilt or crossguard, a two-edged blade that could cleave through anything, but whoever used the sword had to grip it by its blade and turn one of its edges against himself. In spite of its new eyes, mankind still had its roots in base matter. Its soul was woven into matter and subject to its blind laws. But at the same time man could scrutinize matter as though it were a stranger. He could compare himself with other phenomena, uncover and categorize his own vital processes. He came to nature as an unbidden guest. Now in vain he extends his arms and prays to be united with that which created him. Nature no longer answers. It made a miracle with man, but has refused to acknowledge him since. Man has lost his citizenship in the universe. He has eaten from the tree of knowledge and has been banished from paradise. He is powerful in his world, but he curses his power because he has bought it with his soul's harmony, his innocence, his comfort in life's embrace. He stands there with his visions, betrayed by the universe, in bewilderment and angst. Animals, too, know angst, under the roll of thunder and the claw of the lion. But man feels angst for life itself, indeed, for his own being. Life, for animals it is to feel the play of forces, of rut and play and hunger, and at the last, to bow before necessity. Suffering in an animal is limited to itself, for men it builds itself up and spilled out into angst for the world and for life. From the moment the child embarks on his journey down the river of life, the roar of death's waterfall fills the valley, always nearer and nearer. It gnaws at the child's happiness. Man looks out over the earth, and it breathes like a great lung. When it exhales, delicate and graceful life teems out of its pores, and all the creatures stretch out their arms to the sun. But when it takes in its breath, a rustle of fragile spirits breaking sweeps through the multitudes, and their corpses lash the ground like showers of hail. Nor did man see only the number of his own days, but graveyards were exhumed to his view, and the cries of grotesquely decomposed cadavers, the anguish of sunken millennia, beat against him, motherhood's dreams, gone again to earth. The veil of the future was torn aside, and it showed him a nightmare of endless repetitions, a senseless squandering of organic stuff. The suffering of humanity's billions passes into him through the gate of his empathy. Every event sneers at his demand for justice, the principle he holds most dear. He sees his genesis in his mother's womb. He holds out his hand and sees that it has 5 branches. Where does this accursed 5 come from, and what does that have to do with his soul? He is no longer simply at one with himself. In terror he touches his body. This is you, and you extend so far, and no farther. He carries a meal inside himself. Yesterday it was an animal running freely about by its own will. Now he is absorbing it, making it a part of himself. Where does he begin and where does he end? Things blend into each other in sequences of cause and effect, and everything he tries to seize and hold dissolves before his probing thoughts. Soon he sees mechanics behind everything, even behind that which he used to hold dear, his beloved smile. There are other smiles, too, toes peeping through a torn boot. At last the nature of things is only his own nature. Nothing exists but himself. Every road winds back to himself. The world is but a ghostly echo of his own voice. He leaps up with a shriek and wants to vomit himself onto the earth, together with his foul meal. He feels insanity approaching, and tries to kill himself before he loses the power to do even that. But as he stands an instant away from death, he sees the essence of death as well, and the cosmic significance of the step he was about to take. His creative imagination shapes new, terrifying possibilities behind death's door, and he understands that there is no escape even in death. Now at last he can begin to trace the outlines of his cosmic situation. He is the universe's helpless prisoner. He is kept so that he can be condemned to nameless possibilities. From that moment on he finds himself in a state of chronic panic. Such cosmic panic is basic to every human mind. The species, in this light, seems predestined to destruction, since any effort to preserve and continue life is crippled when one's undivided attention and energy is required to stave off the catastrophic pressure of one's inner being. That a species thus becomes unfit for life by reason of an overdevelopment of a single faculty is a tragedy that has befallen not only man. Some contend, for example, that a certain species of deer once walked the earth but was rendered extinct by a set of antlers that had become far too large. Mutations, after all, are blind, thrown into life without a thought to their viability in the environment. When one is depressed and anxious, the human mind is like such antlers, which in all their magnificent glory, crush their bearer slowly to the ground. 3. Then, was the human race not wiped out long ago in great, raging epidemics of insanity? Why are there so few individuals who succumb to the pressure of life because their acuity reveals to them more than they can bear? A consideration of the spiritual history and present state of our species suggests the following answer. Most people manage to save themselves by artificially paring down their consciousness. Had the great antlered elk from time to time managed to break off the outermost prongs of its magnificent headgear, it might have trod the earth a bit longer. In feverish, continual agony, true, but also in betrayal of its essence, its central characteristic, for from the hands of the Creator it had received a commission to be the horn standard-bearer above all the beasts of the field. What it won in continued existence it would have lost in meaning, in existential pride. It would have been a life without hope, a march not toward confirmation of its essence, but past confirmation's ruins, a self-destructive race against the sacred will of its blood. The goal of life and life's own annihilation is common to both the giant elk and the human race. It is their tragic paradox. Faithful to its own essence, the last Cervus giganticus bore the standard of its species to the bitter end. Man saves himself, and continues. Ironically, man's survival is made possible by a more or less conscious suppression of his hazardous surplus of consciousness. This suppression is, for all intents and purposes, continuous. It goes on as long as we are awake and active, and becomes a condition for social adjustment in what is popularly called healthy and normal behavior. Today's psychiatry operates under the assumption that this health and adjustment is the highest goal one can aspire to. Depression, angst, a refusal to eat, and so forth, are taken without exception to be marks of a pathological condition, and are treated accordingly. In many cases, however, these phenomena are indications of a deeper, more immediate experience of what life is all about. Bitter fruits of the genius of the mind or emotion, which is at the root of every anti-biological tendency. It is not the soul that is ill, but its defense mechanism that either fails or is abjured because it is considered, correctly, as a betrayal of man's most potent gift. All life before our eyes is, from its innermost depths to its outermost rim, spun through and through with a crisscrossing net of suppression mechanisms, and we can trace their threads in the most trivial aspects of daily life. These mechanisms are of an almost infinitely colorful variety, but it seems justifiable to indicate at any rate 4 main types, which naturally occur in all manner of combinations: isolation, attachment, diversion, and sublimation. By isolation I mean a completely arbitrary rejection of disturbing, destructive thoughts or feelings. Fully developed and in an almost brutal form, isolation can be observed in doctors who, with an eye to their own self-protection, see only the technical side of their profession. It may also degenerate into pure vulgarity in ordinary thugs or medical students who try to exorcise any sensitivity to life's tragic sides with violence, e.g., playing soccer with the heads of cadavers. In our daily social life, isolation manifests itself through universal, unwritten agreements to conceal our existential condition from one another. This concealment begins with children, in order to save them from being rendered senseless by the life they have just begun, to preserve their illusions until they are strong enough to lose them. In return, children are forbidden to embarrass their parents by untimely allusions to sex, shit, and death. Among adults there are rules about proper behavior, and we see them quite plainly when a man who cries in the streets is taken away by the police. The mechanism of attachment is also at work from early childhood, where parents, home, and neighborhood are taken for granted by the child, and give him a sense of security. This embracing ring of secure experiences are the first and perhaps most successful protection against the cosmos we come to know throughout the rest of our lives, and in these experiences lies an explanation of the much-discussed phenomenon, infantile bonding. Whether these bonds are also sexual is immaterial in this light. When the child discovers in later life that even these secure attachments are just as accidental and fleeting as any other, he experiences a crisis of bewilderment and anxiety, and quickly looks for new attachments. For example, next fall I'm off to college. If for some reason the new attachment does not take, the crisis can either become life-threatening or develop into what I call attachment paralysis. One clings to one's dead values, and tries to hide from oneself and from others their inadequacy and one's own spiritual bankruptcy. The result is permanent insecurity, feelings of inferiority, overcompensation, nervousness. To the extent that the condition can be analyzed, it becomes an object for psychoanalytical treatment, through which one tries to make a successful transferal to new attachments. Attachment can be seen as an attempt to establish fixed points in, or a wall around, the shifting chaos of consciousness. Usually this is an unconscious process, but sometimes it is quite conscious, as for example in an attempt to set some sort of goal for oneself, some reason to live. Generally useful attachments are looked upon with sympathy, and those who give their all for their attachments, their company, or a project, are set up as role models for the rest of us. These heroes have managed to set up a strong bulwark against the dissolution of life, and others are supposed to profit by their example. Even bon vivants, we say, settle down, get married, and have children. The necessary walls are built automatically. We build a certain necessity into our lives. We welcome that which formerly might have seemed an evil, only as a balm for our frayed nerves, a high-walled container for a feeling for life that had become slowly saturated with insecurity. Every social unit is a large, rounded attachment system built on the solid beams of basic cultural ways of thinking. The common man manages with these shared cultural beams. His personality almost builds itself. Our personality has stopped developing and rests on inherited cultural foundations: God, the church, the state, morality, destiny, the laws of life, the future. The closer a norm lies to the bearing beams, the more dangerous it is to disturb it. As a rule, those close-lying norms are protected by laws and threats of punishment, the Inquisition, censorship, conservative attitudes, and so forth. The strength of any one link in a chain of norms depends either on our not seeing through its fictive nature, or on everyone's recognizing that it is a necessary norm, even though we realize that it is a fiction. An example is religious instruction in schools, which is supported even by atheists because they see no other way to compel children to act according to socially accepted norms. As soon as the link's illusory nature or needlessness is perceived by someone, they quickly try to exchange the old norms with newer. There is a saying, truths have a limited life expectancy, and this is the cause of all spiritual and cultural infighting, which, together with economic competition, constitutes the dynamic of world history. The lust for material goods or power is not motivated so much by the direct usefulness of wealth, since nobody can sit on more than one chair at a time or eat more than their fill. The real value of great wealth is that the wealthy have at their disposal a much wider variety of possible attachments or distractions. Precipitates a crisis that is ever more serious the closer the break is to fundamental social norms. In one's inner self, where one is protected by outer walls, crises are encountered daily, but more often minor frustrations than life-threatening disasters. Here one can still toy with attachments, flouting them with mild swearing, social, drinking, vulgar behavior, and so on. But playing these games can unwittingly dig too deeply at a weak spot in one's protective walls and break a hole through into the yawning void. The situation can change in the blink of an epilogue. I from a light-hearted caper. For both individual and collective attachments, a break in the norm chain to a dance of death. The terror of existence stares us in the face, and we realize with a staggering gasp that our minds hang suspended by a web of their own making, and that the abyss of hell gapes below. The most basic beams supporting our culture can only rarely be changed without causing a major social spasm and a threat of total social dissolution, as during a reformation or a revolution. At such times the individual is thrown back upon his own resources. He must develop his own attachments, and there are few who can manage that. Depression, riotous living, and suicide are the result, as was the case for German officers after the First World War. Another weakness in the system is that one must use very different defenses to confound the variety of dangers on all fronts. Each of these bulwarks comes with its own logical superstructure, and the unfortunate result is that conflicts between incommensurable sets of values inevitably arise. The superstructures collide, and despair seeps in through the resulting cracks. Then one can be possessed of a wanton destructiveness, a lust to dismember the entire life support system and, in gleeful terror, try to sweep away the whole mess. The terror is due to the loss of all comforting norms. The glee comes from the resulting purposeless identification in harmony with the deepest acknowledgement of our being, its biological transience, its tendency toward death. We love our attachments because they save us, but we hate them, too, because they hinder our sense of freedom. So when we feel strong enough, it is a pleasure to come together and bury some anachronistic value to the funerary chime of church bells. Material objects are useful as symbols here, and these ceremonies are sometimes called expressions of radicalism. When someone has slain all the attachments he could lay eyes on, he calls himself a liberated man. Diversion is a third popular defense mechanism. With diversion we keep our field of vision within acceptable bounds by keeping it busy with a ceaseless stream of new impressions. This is a typical dodge in childhood. Without diversions a child can't stand himself. Witness the common complaint, "Mom, there's nothing to do." A little English girl I met while she was visiting relatives in Norway used to come constantly in from her room and ask, "What's going on?" Babysitters become virtuosos at diversion. "Look, child, see? They're painting the castle." The phenomena is too well known to require further illustration. Diversion is the whole lifestyle of high society. It can be compared to an airplane, built of the earth, but able, with self-contained energy, to hold itself in the air as long as the energy is maintained. It must always be moving forward, because the air can only support it for an instant. The pilot can become lazy and secure from habit, but once the engine misfires, the crisis becomes acute. Diversion tactics are often quite conscious. We need to steadily divert our attention from ourselves, because despair can lie just under the surface, in a catch of breath or a sudden sob. When all possible diversions are exhausted, we end up in a kind of spleen or peevishness. This ranges from a mild sulk to a lethal depression. Women, as a rule, seem to be more at peace with their existential situation, and are more likely to calm their anxieties through diversion. In fact, a central aspect of punishment by imprisonment is that most opportunities for diversion are denied the prisoner. And, there being few other means for protecting oneself against angst, prisoners are for the most part constantly on the brink of utter despair. Any measures he can find to stave off this despair are justified as an attempt to preserve life itself. For the moment he experiences his soul alone in the universe, there is nothing else to see but the categorical impossibility of existence. Pure, unadulterated despair, life panic, will probably never come to fullness, since defense mechanisms are complex, automatic, and, to some extent, constantly operating. But the no man's land in proximity to despair can also be a kind of death zone, and in them life can continue only under great duress. Death always offers a way out, despite the phantoms that are supposed to lurk behind it, and since the way one feels about death changes with the circumstances, it can even come to seem a welcome escape from life in the death zone. Some people manage, in fact, to build up a proper death, ringing elegies, a glorious last stand, the whole bit, as a final diversion, so there really can be fates worse than death. Newspapers with their gentle obituaries are in this case a mechanism for social suppression, for a change, since they always manage to find a soothing explanation for a death that was really due to despair. For example, it is thought that the deceased took his own life because of the sudden fall in the price of wheat on the commodities market. When a man kills himself in despair, it is an entirely natural death, resulting from spiritual causes. The modern barbarity of trying to save face for the deceased is, then, a horrible misunderstanding of the nature of existence. Few people can survive arbitrary, meaningless changes in their situation, whether it be a change of jobs, a change in the social life, or a change in the way they relax. Most spiritually developed people demand that these changes have a sort of continuity, direction, or progression. For them, no situation can be ultimately satisfying. They must always go a step further, gathering new information, pursuing a career, and so on. These people suffer from an ineradicable yearning to overstep limits, to demand more and more from life, a restless ambition that is never satisfied. When one's previous goal is reached, it becomes only a step to some higher goal. The goal itself, in fact, is immaterial. It is the yearning itself that is important. The absolute height of one's goal is less important than how much higher it is from where one momentarily finds oneself. It is the marginal degree of yearning that counts. The promotion from private to corporal is often more important than from lieutenant to general. Accordingly, this law of marginally increasing demands destroys any hope that progress will be satisfying. There is no end to progress. Human yearning, then, means not just longing after something, but also longing to be saved from something, wherever we are at the moment. And if we use save or salvation in its religious sense, it becomes clear that this is precisely what characterizes the religious experience. Nobody has ever managed to explain what it is they are longing after in religion, but it is quite clear what they are trying to escape from, this earthly vale of tears, one's untenable existence. Tile situation. And if becoming aware of this situation is the greatest truth our souls can reach, it is also clear why religion is thought to be a fundamental need of human beings. In light of the above, however, the hope that there might be some ultimate confirmation for the existence of God seems utterly in vain. With the fourth defense mechanism, sublimation, the mode of operation is transformation rather than suppression. With creative talent or unshakable panache, one might be able to transform the very agonies of life into pleasant experiences. One takes on the evils of life with a positive attitude, which can then twist them into useful experiences. It seizes, for example, on their dramatic, heroic, lyric, or even comic aspects and thus dissolves the terror in them. Sublimation, though, only works so long as these evils have already lost their most bitter sting, or if one manages to sublimate them before despair sinks its fingers firmly into one's mind. Mountaineers, for example, take no pleasure in gazing into the nauseating abyss below them until they have reached a nice, solid belay. Only then can they relish their exposed situation. Writers of tragedy are another example. To write a tragedy, one must first free oneself from, betray, the essence of tragedy, so that one can look at it in a calm, detached way, appreciating its aesthetic qualities. In writing tragedy, one has the luxury of being able to dance from one situation to another and another, steadily worse. There is really no end to the heights the writer can reach. In a way, it is quite embarrassing. The author chases his ego through a countless variety of desperate situations, watching with glee as the situation gets worse and worse, glorying, from a safe distance, in the power of consciousness to destroy itself. This article, in fact, is a classic example of sublimation. Despite his perilous subject, the present writer is not suffering at all. He is merely filling pieces of paper with words, and will probably get paid for the manuscript. For to manage life without all these philosophy, is it possible for so-called primitive peoples? Calspasms and gymnastics? Is it possible for them to live in harmony with themselves in the undisturbed pleasures of work and love? If these beings are to be called humans at all, I think the answer must be no. The most one could say about these children of nature is that they stand a bit nearer the beautiful biological ideal than we urbanized folk. That we have managed to save ourselves in spite of our harrowing existence is mostly due to those sides of our nature that are hardly or appropriately developed. Our heretofore successful defense, of course, cannot create human life, only delay its extinction. Still, our most positive traits are the proper use of our body's strengths and the biologically useful part of our souls. And these traits must operate under stringent conditions, the limitations of our senses, the frailty of our bodies, and the energy-demanding task of keeping our bodies in one piece and our need for affection satisfied. And it is just these conditions, the narrow range of possibilities for happiness, that are so crassly flouted by our modern, growing civilization, its technology, and its standardization. And since a large part of our best biological talents are superfluous in the modern, complicated technological game we play with the environment, we are victims of increasing spiritual unemployment. The value of technological advances for human life must therefore be evaluated according to their ability to afford us increasing spiritual activity, without at the same time destroying the nature that gives us the opportunity to practice these activities. The limits of proper technological development are unclear, but I would venture that the earliest flint scrapers were a good discovery. Every single other technological innovation has had more value to the inventor himself than to anyone else. They represent grand and ruthless larceny from the possibilities for others' experiences, and should be punished with the most stringent penalties if they are made public against the better judgment of an institution established to evaluate them. One crime among many of this sort is the use of aircraft to map unknown areas. In one fell swoop, the tremendously rich possibilities for others' experiences are destroyed, experiences that could have been held in trust for the common interest, such that everyone could have had the joy of discovery after his own efforts. The global fever of life is at the moment characterized by the continual impoverishment of the possibility of spiritually developing experiences. The absence of biologically natural possibilities for fulfilling experience is evidenced by the mass flight to diversions, amusements, competitive sport, radio, the rhythm of the times. Attachments are in a bad way. All the inherited cultural attachments have been shot full of holes by criticism, and dread, anxiety, bewilderment, and despair pours in through these same holes. Communism and psychoanalysis, as different as they are in other respects, both try to construct new versions of the old defense mechanism, with violence and cunning, respectively, to make people useful by cutting down their surplus of insight into life's precariousness. Both of these methods are uncannily logical. But even these attempts will be, in the end, unsuccessful. A purposeful degeneration to a practically useful lower level of consciousness might save the race for a short time, but human nature being what it is, we would not find lasting peace in such a resignation, or in any resignation. If we follow this train of thought through to full execution, when his voice blankets the world like the bitter end, the conclusion is inescapable, a shroud, and his peculiar message is heard for the first as long as humankind blunders along under the dire and last time. Misconception that we are biologically preordained to conquer the earth. No alleviation of our angst for life is the life on many worlds is like a rushing possible. As the number of people on the earth grows, river, but the life on this world is like a stagnant, the spiritual atmosphere will become tighter, and the puddle in the backwater. Fence mechanisms will have to become ever more brutal. The mark of annihilation is written on thy, and we will continue to dream of salvation, read brow. How long will ye mill about on the edge? Redemption, and a new Messiah. But after many saviors, but there is one victory and one crown, and one have been nailed to trees and stoned to death in the salvation, and one answer. Marketplace, then the last Messiah will appear. Know thyselves, be unfruitful, and let there a man will come forth, who before all other men be peace on earth after thy passing. Has dared to strip his soul naked and give himself wholly over to our most profound questioning, even and when he has spoken these words, they will fall to the idea of annihilation. A man who has grasped life upon him, with midwives and wet nurses at their head, in its cosmic context, and whose agony is the agony of, and they will bury him under their fingernails. He is the world. But such a rising wail will assail him from the last Messiah. From father to son, from son after fall the people of the earth, crying for his thousand, he is descended from the archer at the waterhole. Stettened. By Peter Wessel Zapffe. It becomes the burning question whether the true friends of nature are doing the right thing by sharing their discoveries. They are jeopardizing those idyllic spots of peace and rehabilitation, which they next time may find occupied by unworthy ones, brought in their masses by comfortable transport means, guided by their own naively philanthropic views. Cornices of waste are left on the ground after them, and in the air hermetic music is competing with the nature lover's own noises. Hail to the innocent pleasures of the people, whom we all belong to, and no borders should be drawn between human beings. It is in the wilderness that the line must be drawn. There we must begin to build a wall of silence around those values in nature that die when they are taken by force, and that unfold their deepest wonders only in the hour of silent contemplation. But even more dangerous are the hyenas weighing profit, the ones lulling with lyrical tongues and calculating with cold, greedy eyes. Any living creature falling into their claws will be crucified in effigy on their screaming posters, distorted with the standardized exaltation of their brochures. They tear life out of their silent victims and sell the corpses in parts. Protect us, heaven, from the fury of such projects. But Emdestetten in Tisjord is, in a geographical sense, no longer a new find. It has already traveled around the earth on the tongues of many peoples, in images and songs. Silent wanderers from far away came to contemplate under Stedend, a tower soaring skyward. I was among those who felt the calling. Norwegians had crossed the threshold of the holy and showed the believers the way from the courtyard to the heart of the temple, where the consecration takes place. It became my dream to light a campfire at the foot of Stedend, ever since I read Ferdinand Schjeldrup's passionate testimony many years ago. I was facing many obstacles, but eventually the dream became reality. Poets say that dreams die when they come true. Yet my Stedend dream did not die when it merged with reality. My dream was neither to be humiliated, nor to be cropped or bent and trapped inside a miserable cell. This time my dream was to materialize full of life and in all its splendor straight into its earthly manifestation, in a 1,400-meter-high fairy tale castle of silver gray granite. It was 5 o'clock on a glowing white morning in July when we set the plow of our curiosity into the darkening surface of the fjord. There was crushing silence in the boat as we sailed around the last headland, and our eyes could no longer find escape. They were turned in one direction by an unknown force and were held there until it hurt to look. Giant, majesty, horn of hell, the words fall short in our minds to adequately describe the shock of the first confrontation. From the cairn in the sunlit clouds to the cairn in the deep there stretched one smooth sheer cliff 3,000 meters high, only interrupted where the fjord lines gathered in sublime harmony. Not much was said while the ice-cold water was biting our bare legs as we unloaded our baggage from the bottom of the boat onto the white, sun-dried shell beach. We were in a hurry, because water was threatening us both from below and above. The fjords fill their lungs and exhale violently. The sky changes fast from joy to grief. Experienced hands were building up the camp, our home for 1 week on an alien beach, while the first raindrop started drumming on the last luggage case on its way into Ole Anderson's boathouse. I wake up in my sleeping bag and know that today is the day. It is warm and comfortable in here. The world around me is set up according to my will. It makes me feel calm and safe. I lie and feel that I hate this damned mountain, because it has power over my mind. This stupid injustice on the top of 5 billion tons of granite. What do you want from me, who has traveled countless miles to get here from a more joyful place just to exhaust myself on your endless slopes and hang there like a culprit facing his end? You, mystically terrible, you, sphinx above all fog. I hate you, because you have shattered me and shaken me to the core and will not give me peace of heart before I have you under my iron heel. Are you then a woman, igniting painful arrows in our chests? No, you are the eternal masculine, a colossal sculpture of solemn, supreme, virile power. It is better not to think about it any longer. The rain has stopped and I can already hear rambling kettles from Deck's tent. We are taking off. It is time for thoughts inside a snug sleeping bag to give way to the deeds of the day. The company has split into 2 groups. I am going with Deck and Simon Anderson Storlv over the ridge from the southeast, the only known access point until now. Arne Ness and Els Hertzberg will be seeking new routes on the southern face. Our team looks somewhat ordinary, whereas these 2 meager eagles of the abyss are loaded with ropes, bolts, carabiners, hammers, shoes and food packages, and underneath it all garments of unknown fabrics and cuts, enough to make the perception of an uninitiated observer shatter. Their mission is not an extraordinary one, which becomes obvious after a slightest sullen glance up the sky-high, armor-smooth mountain face, on which they will crochet their way upward with their odd ironmongery. Worlds of scree and slopes of naked rock are now separating us from our friends in the Transcendental League. Lumps of clay as we are, forced adherents of the alpine imminence, we choose the route where hand and foot find support in the good old sense of the word. But from Hall's height we hear distant, fading hammer strokes from the opposite mountain face, tiny bell chimes in the whizzing space. And with a 6 barrels ice we detect 2 colorful grains out on the edge of the plunging stonewall, hung up on hooks like martyrs between the sheer cliffs. Wonderfully and terribly skilled people. And what about the autocracy of man? Are we going to be driven away by curly, bright-haired usurpers from our last refuge, our humble footsteps up on the mountainside? We shout, but the wind catches the weak human sound in its cheerful game, tumbling hither and thither, and tosses it away in some unknown crevice, where it shrivels into a sigh and eventually dies. Back to work. We gather on the western side of Hall's Height and look at the peak. Either the Pan, or the Earth Spirit, or the devil himself has tightened the 200-meter clothesline from the block we are standing on over to the eastern face of the great peak, where freshly smoothed 1,000-meter high cliffs are broken off in the middle and hung up to dry. 3 tiny clothes pegs sitting astride and slowly wriggling over to the other side, holding on to the edge and riding the swinging span. Ride on. Away with the clothesline, bring in the timber. A death stallion on its hind legs with a reeking mane is the animal that carries us across the void. We jab him with sharpened spurs and speed up as the air streams clash behind us. Finally we are on the other side and we pat him in gratitude, step off and proceed on foot. The ridge is spacious and broad here. We sit down to rest on a pile of gravel, eat lots of food, drink lots of juice and lie down on our backs, legs splayed and smoking a pipe, while our eyes are wandering through the sky. We still have a few hundred meters left to the top, but why rush? It is good to be here, and the day is still young and the night belongs to us. We are absolutely cool and calm on the outside and quite deep inside our bodies and souls. But what is in our innermost being? They say that there is a cliff up there that one cannot bypass, a slab that has to be crossed hanging by your arms, a climb that people, who have done it, somehow never stop talking about. Well, come what may, let's not cross that bridge until we come to it. We are not in a hurry. A gust of strong wind wakes us from our doze and Simon catches a boot on its way into the abyss. The wind blows stronger, it plays the comb on the scraggy ridge and the monstrous organ pipes of the northern face are gurgling. We shiver with cold, put our rubber boots on quickly and prepare our ropes. Deck is given the honorable task of leading us through the crucial 10 meters that stretch between uncertainty and triumph. We are soon standing on the narrow ledge that stretches between the safety on one side and the void itself on the other. This is the credo, pia absurdia moment. Tiptoeing on the uttermost point of the ledge, the first man stretches himself through the abyss to reach for the slab. Then he proceeds hanging by his arms while his body and legs are hanging like a dead weight. He disappears around the corner, and now I am the one standing in the last bend of the ledge feeling small. Am I dreaming? Is this a part of a human earthly path? Could this possibly be a mountain, this hardened shape, this avalanche of yellow-gray rock that plunges from the ridge down into the forest with ghost-like speed in a 1,000-meter sweep? At least I have to treat it so, as if it was, and signal the one up there and get myself out. It is a landscape out of this world, yet these whims of the cosmic forces are turned into a path under my clasping hands. During these nameless seconds I sense how the wide stream of my destiny flows into nothing in this passage of 6 or 8 embittering fingertip grips. We sit by the cairn and let our eyes wander. From the mirage lands of Lofvedveggen in the west to the cold glacier glow in the east. There is a reek coming from the abyss and a drift coming from the sky, as the storm and the fog are being crushed against the rocks and ravines. Vision and sound merge into a saga about the eternal sovereignty of the minerals. Life forms are frothing around the foot of the mountain just like the mist that forms, changes and disappears in the sky. Not only has Stettin seen ages of man from its height, it witnessed the ages of the earth. It stands like a pillar in the stream of time, and cleaves the striding glacier like a plow. But the glacier disappeared and the warmth came, and brontosauruses started grunting under the palms. And Stettin became drowsy from the steam and pulled a blanket of haze over its head and dozed for a while. Now, the old Anders Nilsson is padding here in Cowberry Heather. And yet in autumn, as the great stranger comes to reap his harvest and his eyes go wandering along the sullen mountain faces, that is when a single stone might loosen and fall off. The weather is rough as we are gnawing our way through the fjord in Simon's ramshackled vessel. Squalls are hunting under the heavy stratus as the rain and the salty waves hit our necks. Then the clouds burst, and he is standing before us once again, the Titan, wreathed in lightning, casting water, shining like emery polished iron. Thunder belches around him, but it does not affect him, nothing affects him, as he sits enthroned in his Olympic indifference over the hectic course of life, an anvil for the gods to hammer on. Farewell, Norway. By Peter Wessel Zapffe. This story, an interview with Jorgen, the old man of the mountains, did not turn out quite the way we expected. Dren's ideas are often untimely and extremely controversial. Even so, the editor doesn't wish to waste the report, and besides, even the most unlikely things sometimes have their purposes. Editor, to get right to the point, sir, what do you think is the best way to make our mountain ranges accessible to as many people as possible, seeing that these areas are still, as far as recreation is concerned, undeveloped? Jorgen, i.e. your pardon? I mean areas where visitors still run the risk of bumping into something that's not in the brochure. Are you in favor of small public cabins or big hotels? Which do you think is better, highways, railroads, aerial cable lifts, or tunnels for cog railways, as a means of getting as many people as possible into the heart of our alpine grandeur? Hearts should not be exposed to heavy tourist traffic at all. Up to 1910, May, it was appropriate to open up the mountains. Nowadays the need is quite the opposite, to lock up the few mountainous areas that are left. The last reserves. Not to people who are re-ally their friends. Just to the ones called engineer and restaurant chain. You mean wilderness preservation? Preservation is a pain to viron wilderness, the same way that a vaccination hurts a still healthy OD. These days we do not even have the chance to preserve wilderness. The only hope is to save ourselves from the total Norwegisch Landschaft, Norwegian Technolandscape. I have to say it in German, we don't have a word for it in our own Land UAE. You mean, save ourselves from high-tension lines and such? I mean from the whole filthification of Norway. We have already desecrated the most beautiful places to make room for foreign exchange factories, mountain resorts. Concrete oxes called Sunnycrest and Shady Glade to entice asphalt gypsies who soon discover that Sunnycrest is a parking lot and that the moist air from alpine cascades is tainted by the avalanches of airy from the tourist corral down below, while the silvery mountain brook is sucked down the outlet of a hydro project up Ave. Now, we say mildly, maybe it does get a little tacky sometimes, and things happen so fast nowadays that resorts will do almost anything to keep their costs down. But think of all the people who turn around in disgust with a lump in their throat. They have competitors up there, do they? If it is owing to eat do, I don't really care which do eats which. Whom are you thinking of, exactly? I am thinking of the plow of development. I mean the mountain lakes turned into stone-dead, concrete-lined tanks, varnished slaw heaps from construction projects. I went trawling in one of those lakes last year. I caught a 28-pound rusty I carry. I am thinking of all the waterfalls dried up by hydro projects, and with them the waterfalls of the Norwegian spirit. I am thinking of mountain plateaus turned into shattered corpses by the 20th century treasure hunt. I am thinking of idiotic roads that are supposed to ease access, skate scars over moors and passes, through undisturbed forests emptied of wildlife, along dried-up rivers and fished-out lakes, flanked by drifts of trash, while the waste products of the last link in the metabolism of resource processing. Look at Vassfaret, look at Femenmarka. Words like Eric or vandalism do not describe what happened to those beautiful plaques. We have to resort to words like treason to describe the rape that has been committed here. Look at Lake Alta in Bardo, formerly a dream each, 70 miles of clouderies and birch forests. Now, with a shout of victory, it has been transformed into thousands of acres of foul, stinking, coal-lack mire. They were owing to dam the lake and drown the forest, and these eastern heirs OT worried that they wouldn't be able to float their oats or pull their nets through the lake, because they'd eat caught on the drowned trees. So they planned the dam so that the water level will come to 60 feet at the treetops. Nutty told them that in winter, when they draw the water level down 120 feet lower than it used to that the forest would hon hih overhead, the makar skeletons of birch trees marching down the mountainside. You cannot land the ode on the shore, it's just rocks and cliffs now, a nightmare landscape, it is the river Styx you are rowing in, Norway's rave, Norway emptied to the dregs of its soul. And Nutty complains. Nutty wants to eat a wet blanket at the celebration of progress. Young people's interests have already made the leap from farming to hunting out at hammer stands and early racks. Hydropower engineers come on the radio and say how sorry they are for the poor little birch trees that unfortunately happened to hinder in the march of progress. We need economic growth one way or the other, they say. They do it for the good of Norway. Things like that are unfortunate, I admit. But isn't it a good thing that the village gets electricity? Of course, that is not why they build the dams. That is only a commune. The villas can neither finance nor use all that hydropower. Buyers must be found, in tourist payments covered, we have to people to yield factories and subdivisions to consume all that electric ity. The hydro project has the villi, not the other way around. Die ich reef, die Geister, the Enis out of the Adel. It's too late for Apollois, and know it to despair. Goodness knows there is a now reason to despair. But the municipality is caught atween a rock and a hard place. Look at Lake Gend. In view of the economic benefits they were supposed to et from the project, the farmers there demanded $500,000 a year in compensation if it wasn't yield. These same farmers can't afford to let their daughters sit around at home and wait for a man who doesn't know the first thin aid investments. is free and now with kindness and affection. No, send them down to the streets of the I-City. They can earn a lot there, $20 a night, almost $8,000 a year. Multiply that by hundreds of earls. It's no worse than prostituting the landscape, anyways. You're joking, of course. It is only a matter of degree. We are in the grip of development Neanderthals. It is a marathon that they are descended from humans, these lummoxes with lumped, sterile minds. They are not really alive, they can only keep on economic stimulants. We're replaced by people who don't deserve a healthy earth. People for whom the only important thing is how high their paychecks are. Yes, the self-reliant family made way for the money economy. But that's inevitable, it's just another part of development. If we want to get something, we have to give something up. Let me tell you what development really is. Development is pure panic, an itching of the soul that has to be scratched and clawed at until every stone and every lit flea hill in the country is covered with incurable eczema. Where is the philosophy of life? Where is the vision of the future? Where is the all that Ives development direction? What is Norway after? What is the idea, the intention, the purpose, to its life as a nation? Well, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, or something like that. Just like anywhere else in the world. What you call happiness, my friend, is more a description of our frivolous chase than a description of actually somewhere, having something. Happiness, like anything else, can a means to an end. But nothing can help a person or a people to get happiness unless they have the ability to be happy in themselves. Those who throw away the present for the sake of the future will never achieve it. People have tried that way off and on for over 6,000 years. Where do you suppose it's oddness, we who sit here, the result of 100 generations blood, sweat, and tears? We still have a few priceless, uninfected bits of Norwegian wilderness left that could help us hear life the way it is. Instead we lindly and to a man shove real happiness aside and chase after shadows. From one means to another, and means to what? To a spiritual rescheduling of our loans, to a collective psychological deficit that is only renewed, never repaid. And pity the man who tries to slow down, to shout a warning. He's an outsider, an enemy of the people, he doesn't deserve to live. Nutty even off heirs to a row with him, they just toss him away, with all the other airy. Now, just a minute. You make it sound like it's somebody's fault. Development, you know, feeds on itself. We can't really rein it in or direct it anymore. The population is always growing, they assert their demands, they can't live on gardening and sport fishing, they need more electricity, more industry. It's as plain as day. You can't dispute it. Oh. And who said we should increase the population? My dear Jorgen, we say, with an anxious glance at the way the conversation is going, you can't very well stop life, can you? Life must go on. There isn't anything called life. In any case, it is something that we have, not something that has us. It has no metaphysical substance. That is just one of the clever myths we've made for ourselves to keep us from staring truth in the face. The truth is life does not pair from nothing. UT is a result of the deliberate desi science of every set of parents. As an old acler, I am sure of it. I made a decision to eat childless, and I stick to it. That's how much your life must go on means. When man became self-conscious, that was the end of life as a natural force. Our awakening consciousness laid that specter to rest. Or should have. But the people, there's obviously no stopping them. But the day will come when they'll stop of their own accord. Today the total weight of the Norwegian population is 220.000 tons. In this country, the only commonly shared goal is to increase, or quadruple the amount of people. The God of our times is called multiplier. He is omnipotent and omnipresent. He guarantees that 6 times 5 is 30, irrespective of whether this amounts to shit or to lilies. Each and every new cradle is a temple in his honor. Rows of houses with rows of people, apartment blocks with blocks of people, mass production of efficient people. In a world of mathematicians nutty others to ask what all these numbers are supposed to mean. Well, we need these people to maintain vital industries and things, to innovate, to make things better. Besides, these social problems are being worked on by both public institutions and private citizens. Everyone is concerned about them. Yes, the outlook for these problems is pretty grim if we can't raise children to look after them. If there were fewer people instead of more, we would be in danger that these problems would disappear. Talk keen with them. 96% of what makes life interesting, off for the current and future generations. So, of course, we need the clerks, and the clerks need electricity so they can design new, endless housing developments for helpless people who need electricity. And one day we'll reach 10 million people. By using up all of our natural resources, draining the last wetland area, building atomic-powered greenhouse skyscrapers, we'll be able to feed 12 or 15 million. Wonderful. But it won't stop there, you know. What are you going to do when 20 million wage slaves stand tight as blades of grass, from one end of the country to the other, with the smell of each other's welfare wafting up their nostrils? Not everyone will be a wage slave. Quite right. Some will drive bulldozers, others will scurry around picking up the droppings of herds of tourists. And what do you think the tourists will come here to see, anyway? Corrugated iron they have at home. Well, there are the museums. Yes. I had forgotten the museums. Somehow it never occurred to me that everything worth seeing could be packed into a display case. Well, but nature takes care of itself. If the population gets too high, there will be a war or a plague. And that's what you want for your children. Well, actually I figure that by that time we'll be able to emigrate to Mars. Sure, and ITLLE exit in the first week. Eventually, though, people will start worrying how much to tax the uranium mines in order to keep the price of marijuana down. Yes, we can certainly look forward to at least that relief. The whole thing will repeat itself. But you forget, Jorgen, people adapt. What seems like an impossible way of life to us will seem commonplace to our descendants, who will never have experienced anything else. True. Ado is happy ein ado. If our descendants come those, they surely won't miss Beethoven. Only the transition will hard. We're owing through that transition now, our generation, the last that remembers what Norway was. We are homeless already, linguistically and hierarchically. We have lost our sense of place. Not like refugees, for even if their home is forever closed to them, it still lives in their dreams. We're homeless because we've sold nature's innocence to the technological despots and made her into a raved whore. When we look to her, we see not a smiling face a sickly death wren, lacking with swarming flies. There's a bitter irony in Rice Anderson's poem. One must take a 7 low step away from the picture in order to see it the way the master wanted it seen. Well, Jorgen, you certainly don't mince words. But people are going to call you a misanthropist. Because I am thinking 8 the generations to come. They're the ones who will become the human co-wheels, the wheel of life, as sculptor Gustav Weiland called it. Have you seen the statue in the park in Oslo? Misanthropic? Because I think future generations should not have to suffer this fate. The word means different things to different people. But you wouldn't go so far as to take someone's life. That would only increase suffering. There's a world of difference between saying we should level Oslo and saying we shouldn't build a new Oslo in the middle of the wilderness. When I say, with Nietzsche, verdorben ist die Erde durch die Vil zu wählen, the earth is destroyed by the Altumni, that doesn't mean that I'd kill anyone. If someone has to die, I'd be the first to volunteer. View it this way, the Yechenorn are always the majority. If you add up all the people living now and all those waiting in the winds, the sum is always infinite, no matter how many actually eat orn. We can't fit all the unknown on the earth at the same time. Every hour an astronomical number of potential people are cheated out of life why people decide not to eat prenant. Arrow, it's no more erroric to limit the present population to 1 million than it would be to limit it to 20 million. But what's so special about a population of exactly 1 million? That's just a number. But if we only had 1 million people in Norway, there'd be ample room for all. Everyone could have as much land as he was interested in cultivating, empty each to yield on, unexplored terrain for skiing, all the fishing and hunting one could possibly want. Then we wouldn't need to manage wide some bureaucracy. Life's problems would not be solved, they would not be made worse. But a primitive society like the one you envision couldn't maintain a television system, for example. Just so. But you also forget the most important thing. Norway would become a power vacuum, militarily speaking. How long do you think it would take before the vacuum were filled by others? Yes. We must continue to rein Norwegians into the world so that we don't get invaded by the Russians. That's something I had not considered. Well, Jorgen, you're old and wise. But why do you only talk about these things with your old mountaineering comrades? Surely they're hardly a philosophical bunch. I talk with them because in their sport is a deep philosophy. It touches a piece of the incomprehensible, the magnificent, the consciousness expanding cosmic adventure of what it is to be a human ein in the world. Its face is turned toward death and nature, not toward the stilted, alien artificiality of human fellowship. I talk with them because they still have some of their earthly nature intact. They live in a yet uncontaminated nature. From there will come the fight to turn the tide, if it comes at all. Rocks may be dead, they are not diseased. The more you climb, the more your odi pures itself of the poisons accumulate in human society. When you have a now air under your heel, the poisons lose their grip and sink into the depths like mustard as. You become purified, and more, you eat an antiity in your system, you can oac into the world and remain immune. You become an antibiotic in a degenerating world. Do you think it would do any good to talk about this to the youth? Of course not. But it doesn't matter. I elong to a Van Ischen read. That is why I say, farewell, Norway. The country is in foreign hands. Parting with Gloucester. By Peter Wessel Zapffe. The sides of the mountain tremble, gravel flies around, and splaying gondola towers rise up to the sky. The barracks encroach further and further, while hundreds of men chisel a saw the length of a mile into the giant's rib. Next winter cars will be queuing up at Svaneroy. Nature is subdued, not defeated in battle, but crushed by machines. The visitors that step out of their cars will get the summit served à la carte, together with their steaks. They think they are entitled to this, not so much thanks to their perseverance or their love for the mountain, but merely because of the size of their wallets. The next thing is the extension of the cableway to the peak. It will provide the public at large with opportunities to enjoy. Enjoy what, exactly? The view, of course. That of which we fall asleep when traveling by plane. But most of all they will enjoy the resort, their own presence, and each other's company. It was something the public at large could previously do as well, in front of the hotel or behind, but change makes people happy and so does progress. In the Alps some peaks can already be done in an unconscious state of mind. Did you go up the Zugspitze, Sir Nelson? Possibly. We were fairly tipsy that day. Things change in the eye of the beholder, both in science and in everyday life. The Gloucester summit that will now be made accessible will be different once it is accessible. Most places have their forerunners. A man in Tromsø wrote, "Too few people enjoy the enthralling loneliness of Ornedalen. Once the road is there, this will change." He was right. Now everyone can bus themselves to Ornedalen. But what should they do there? For advertising has so many other, untouched, places to offer. Saving you, Gloucester, is no longer in the hands of a single human. He can only lament for your dying soul. You have been sacrificed by people who fear heights, in the landscape as well as in their own minds. If fresh mountain air can be transformed into compost in Rjukan, so can the golden morning glory around your summit be turned into jangling gold for hotel owners. Parting with Gloucester. You will help raise a new generation, one that does not know that values stem from self-restraint, a generation that rattles around from victory to victory, without realizing that the price for this is the joy of creation. Whether a later generation will rescue you from this degradation and remove the last rusty scraps of the dark age of technological naivete, that we cannot tell today. Without hope, your faithful mourn. For them, your fate will be illuminated by the holy glare of tragedy. Because you were beautiful, you had to die. Philosopher of Tragedy. By Thomas Hilland Eriksson. Perhaps one does not have to be a mountaineer in order to be a Norwegian philosopher, but it probably helps. The most famous person to combine the two vocations is octogenarian Arne Næss, an early adherent of logical positivism who later in life turned to ecological thinking and is known internationally as the founder of deep ecology. Næss has two standard responses to journalists asking him why he climbs. Either he would say, in his Buddhist sage fashion, because it's there, or, if the journalist is male, why did you give it up yourself? The number of other Norwegian philosophers who have a weakness for the experience of dangling helplessly in ropes from dizzying heights is such that there is bound to be a connection between the balancing art of mountaineering and national philosophies. Nowhere is that connection more evident than in the life of Peter Wessel Zapffe, arguably the most original Norwegian philosopher of this century. Peter Wessel Zapffe, the son of a pharmacist, was born in Tromsø in 1899 and died in 1990. He wrote in many genres, including literary essays, drama, and poetry. Indeed, as a law student, he not only endeavored to climb one of the neoclassical columns outside the University of Oslo, but he also submitted a long, rhyming poem as an exam paper, doubtless to his tutor's bottomless despair. Be this as it may, Zapf's major work was a massive treatise on human tragedy, Om det tragisk, published during the Second World War. This masterpiece was written at the same time as Sartre was working out the doctrine later to be world famous as existentialism. Sartre wrote in a world language, while Zapf's Dano-Norwegian was never translated. Had it been published in German, English, or French, the book might have been a classic today. Zaffe's main argument and worldview was, roughly, this: like all living species, humans are endowed with a certain number of physiological and social needs, the need for food, rest, security, and so on. These needs are quite easily satisfied. However, we humans have an additional need, lacking in all other species, for an overarching meaning of life. This need, according to Zapffe, can never be satisfied unless we deceive ourselves. We can thus either delude ourselves into belief in a false meaning of life, or we can remain honest and realize that life is meaningless. Unlike Sartre's existentialism, which was ultimately an optimistic doctrine, Zaffe's existential view was bleak. His great survey of tragedy in literature, politics, and the arts indicated that all human endeavor was ultimately futile. He was a worthy heir to the great German pessimist Schopenhauer, and his view on the human destiny was simply that we ought to stop procreation immediately. Others have tried to out-Zapffe, most eloquently another Norwegian mountaineer and philosopher, Herman Tønnesen, the author of the essay Happiness is for the Pigs. Tønnesen argued, against Zaffe's view that life is meaningless, that life is not even meaningless. Zapffe was a complex man with a great, if dark, sense of humor. One of his most admired books was a collection of essays on the outdoor life, Barskit Lieder, Rough Joys, and he even published a collection of stories and jokes from his home region. His passion for mountaineering was tantamount to a passion for teasing the God whose existence he denied. Upon hearing of the tragic death of a fellow philosopher, who had been rammed in the chest by a freak boulder during climbing, he reputedly wrote, after expressing his regrets, "I am given to understand that the boulder changed its direction and came after him. That's God." By Giles R. Tangens. Teddy to those that think, a tragedy to those that his world, mused Horace Walpole, is a calm feel. And for Peter Wessel Zapffe, 1899 to 1990, humans are condemned to do both. We have evolved a yearning for metaphysical purpose, for intrinsic justice and meaning in any earthly event, that is destined for frustration by our real environment. The process of life is oblivious to the beings it makes and breaks in the course of its perpetuation. And while no living creature escapes this carnage, only humans bear the burden of awareness. An uninhabited globe, argues Zapffe, would be no unfortunate thing. Born in the Arctic city of Tromsø, in Norway, Zapffe was a luminous stylist and wit, whose law examination paper, 1923, in rhyming verse, remains on display at the University of Oslo. Following some years as a lawyer and judge, he had a revelatory encounter with the plays of Ibsen and re-entered university to attack the ever-burning question of what it means to be human. The answer he reached is an original brand of existentialist thought, which, unlike the more optimistic views of Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus, concludes in a minor key. Among its earliest airings was a little essay called The Last Messiah, 1933. The piece begins with a fable of a Stone Age hunter who, as he leaves his cave at night, is stricken by pity for his prey and has a fatal existential crisis. This is a parable resonating with two archetypical tales of Western culture. Firstly, it recalls the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, which also relates the eye-opening exit of a cave. Secondly, it alludes to that origin myth of moral sentiment, the fall of man in Genesis. Zapffe chimes in with an exegesis to the effect that his caveman was a man who knew too much. Evolution, he argues, overdid its act when creating the human brain, akin to how a contemporary of the hunter, a deer misnamed the Irish elk, became moribund by its increasingly oversized antlers. For humans can perceive that each individual being is an ephemeral eddy in the flow of life, subjected to brute contingencies on his or her way to annihilation. Yet only rarely do persons lose their minds through this realization, as our brains have evolved a strict regime of self-censorship, better known as civilization. Betraying a debt to Freud, Zapffe expands on how most people learn to save themselves by artificially limiting the content of consciousness. So, isolation is the repression of grim facts by a code of silence, anchoring, the stabilizing attachment to specific ends, distraction, the continuous stream of divertive impressions, and sublimation, the conversion of anguish into uplifting pursuits, like literature and art. The discussion is sprinkled with allusions to the fate of Nietzsche, the poster case, as it were, of seeing too much for sanity. Lastly, Zapffe warns that civilization cannot be sustained forever, as technology liberates ever more time for us to face our demons. In a memorably ironic finish, he completes the tribute to Plato and Moses by foretelling a last Messiah to appear in a tormented future. This prophet of doom, an heir to the visionary caveman, will be as ill-fated. For his word, which subverts the precept to be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, is not to please his fellow men. Know yourselves, be infertile, and let the earth be silent after ye. The Messiah's ideas are developed at greater length in the treatise on the tragic, 1941, unaccountably never translated into any major language. The work is rigorously argued, yet so suffused with carnivalesque humor that one critic acclaimed its author as the chaplain of philosophy. Nor is there want of poetic imagery. At one point, for instance, a sea eagle bred in cage is evoked as an analogy to the human predicament. While unable to manifest its potential in captivity, such an eagle should doubtless perish if released into the open sky. That dilemma highlights a fundamental concept of Zapfe's tome, the objectively tragic sequence, that is, any narrative in which excellence is linked to misadventure. Aristotle's theory of tragedy in the Poetic centers on the debacle of a generally virtuous individual who makes a fateful error of judgment, expressing a latent flaw of character. By contrast, objectively tragic tales do not hinge on any fault of the protagonist, rather a manifestation of culturally relevant greatness prefigures his demise. Such excellence either engenders the calamity or is else instilled in the protagonist by whatever does, for instance, a disease. To clarify his model, Zapffe introduces a hierarchy of interest fronts, biological, social, autotelic, pertaining to whatever is rewarding in itself, and metaphysical. The latter one, essential to humanity, requires a dual virtue for objectively tragic sequences to unfold, i.e., aspirations to secure a just and meaningful world, and 2. Intellectual honesty. Insofar as I alone is found in a character, whether real or a fictional, her response to absurdity and injustice should be to sacrifice lower-ranking interests on behalf of the metaphysical one. This sets the stage for what Zapffe labels a heroic sequence of events. A tragic sequence demands the addition of 2, and peaks with a devastating realization that existence never will become satisfactory in terms of meaning and justice. For Zapffe, such resignation to futility marks the apex of many classic tragedies, from Prometheus Bound to Hamlet. His most intriguing case in point is the Book of Job, in the Bible, which given its seemingly happy ending was never anybody's idea of a tragic tale. Yet on Zapfe's reading, Job has the misfortune to uncover the Lord's genuine nature, a benighted tyrant, mistaking might for right. Even martyrdom would be lost on this godly Caliban, and the disillusioned Job takes cover behind a mask of repentance. His is a timeless tragedy, for Jehovah holds sway in our experience, even today, as the symbol of a familiar social and biological environment. He represents the blind natural forces oblivious to the human craving for order and meaning, the unpredictable strikes of illness and death, the transience of fame, the betrayal of friends and kin. He is the god of machines and might, of rule by violence, Moscow tribunals, party yoke and conquest, of copper pipes and armor plates. Job is not alone to face him with spiritual arms. Some are downtrodden in heroic martyrdom, others see the limitations of martyrdom as well, yielding in the outer things, but hiding despair in their hearts. The human condition is so structured, then, that objectively tragic sequences will readily arise, which is ultimately why they are described as objective. Not only is humankind distinguished by an impossible interest, the need for purpose in a realm of pure causality, it also excels at comprehending that realm. We relate to the truth as do moths to a flame. Thus the thousand consolatory fictions that deny our captivity in dying beasts afloat on a speck of dust in the eternal void. And after all, if a godly creator is waiting in the wings, it must be akin to the Lord in the book of Job, since it allows its breathing creations to be tumbled and destroyed in a vast machinery of forces foreign to interests. Asserts Zapffe, the more a human being in his worldview approaches the goal, the hegemony of love in a moral universe, the more has he become slipshod in the light of intellectual honesty. The only escape from this predicament should be to discontinue the human race. Though extinction by agreement is not a terribly likely scenario, that is no more than an empirical fact of public opinion. In principle, all it would require is a global consensus to reproduce below replacement rates, and in a few generations, the likening of humankind would not be the stars or the ocean sand, but a river dwindling to nothing in the great drought. This rather less than life-affirming message is actually not without historical precedence. In a preface to the 1983 edition of On the Tragic, Zapffe refers to the insight, or gnosis, that the mystery of life is amoral. That is no mere figure of speech. His philosophy does indeed suggest the mystical viewpoint known as Gnosticism, influenced by Judaism and Platonism and flourishing early in the Christian era. Gnostic doctrines generally teach as follows. Our innermost selves began on a deific plane. The fullness, pleroma, but were dispersed around the earthly shadowland and locked into a cycle of rebirths at the dawn of time. They may break free and reunite through gnosis, the awareness of their divinity, promoted by holy messengers. Yet the majority keep mistaking the dominion of death for home and partake in its reproduction, encouraged by cosmic slavers, archons, who serve the ignoble creator of matter, the deity of the Old Testament. As Hans Jonas noted in the 1950s, this esoteric lore resembles, to some degree, the outlook of modern existentialism. Both depict the human self as somehow thrown into, and incarcerated in, a foreign world, in which it mindlessly acquiesces unless woken by a sense of alienation. With Zapffe, the match appears closer than usual, for if he denies, like most existentialists, that humankind belongs in a heavenly home, he also echoes Gnostics in rejecting its continuance on earth. Zapffe defended On the Tragic for his doctoral degree, not a risk-free act in the German-occupied Norway of the day. His friend Arne Næss, later the originator of deep ecology, took a break from resistance work to serve as opponent. After liberation, Zapffe turned down a professorship to live instead by his essays, monographs, poetry, plays, and humorous writings. Many of the latter address a favorite activity, the art of mountain climbing. This he extolled for being as meaningless as life itself. Destinations included, incidentally, the spire of Tromsø Cathedral, whence he proclaimed that he could not ascend further by means of the church. Some find his zeal as a mountaineer, humorist, and early champion of environmental conservation rather at odds with his philosophical pessimism. According to another friend and eco-philosopher, Sigmund Seatrain, this paradox is resolved by considering the light bliss founded on dark insight of the Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, a awakened sage who accepts the futility of human accomplishment. In any case, Zapffe lived as he taught in reproductive matters, staying childless by design. Apart from Berit Zapffe, his spouse through 47 years, his name is now borne only by one of the Arctic mountains he pioneered. As for M. T. Zapfe's philosophical counterpart, it presents an austere, yet impressive, vista of the earthly vale of tears. In a letter dated 1990, its conqueror described his view from the final cairn: the human race comes from nothing and goes to nothing. Above that, there is nothing. At the close of his last major writing, Zapffe answers all who despair of this view. Unfortunately, rues the playful pessimist, I cannot help you. All I have for facing death myself is a foolish smile. Peter Wessel Zapffe. Die Norwegische Landschaft. Zapffe as conservationist. Early in his life, Peter Wessel Zapffe came to in 1941, on the other, the prolific mountaineer, writer, rather distressing insight: life is impermanent religion critic, photographer, lawyer, and philosopher, and our possibilities in it are limited. It might Zapffe displayed his many talents. Be hard for a healthy and normal functioning Zapfe's philosophical perspective can be sum a person to face the fact that he should need 100 raised as follows, humans, because of their mental ca. Lives instead of one, so as not to take 99% of his potential with him in his grave. Despite, or maybe rather because of, this perception of things, Zapffe, during his 90 years long life, played on many different strings, and with great proficiency. From his humorous publication Barski Glieder og andre Timerer fra et liv under åpen himmel, rough joys and other themes from a life lived under the open sky, at one extreme side, to his pessimistic view on life as expressed in his dissertation Om det tragisk, on the tragic. Pacities have become sovereign masters over all other life, but the price for this has been high. While all other organisms have capacities that are in proportion to the challenges they are faced with, wings to fly, sharp teeth, fast-moving legs, and so on, humans have an excess of consciousness which is deeply tragic. Our ability to be conscious and self-consciousness constitutes an unanswered cry in the dark, begging for a sense of purpose and meaning. Is there any meaning at all in anything? For animals, when they suffer, this remains limited to the physical pain itself, but for humans it can aggravate into bottomless fear and existential doubt. From the very moment we, as Zapffe did, start to see ourselves as nothing more than a conglomerate of pure matter that, for the durance of a moment, is on its way from eternity to eternity, we have become the universe's helpless captives, and the cosmic panic becomes something very real. Are we able to handle this pressure of life, as Zapffe called it? The biological response to our excess of consciousness is the application of a broad range of anchoring mechanisms, entertainment, distraction, divertisement, and organized pastime, all aimed to uphold biological functionality, as it maintains a bulwark against our deepest and darkest forms of awareness. Why, then, hasn't mankind gone extinct long ago already, during great epidemics of madness? Zapffe asks himself. In many ways, this can be regarded as the essence of his philosophy, as articulated in his essay Den Sitzt Meshes, The Last Messiah, 1937. His conclusion was, know thyself, be infertile and let there be peace on earth after thy passing. Is this really the same Zapffe who, in his stories of a life under open skies, displayed such a great sense of humor and a rich and elegant use of language? Even though his pessimistic view on our human existence can be regarded as the basic backdrop of the whole of his life and his works, it is hard to catch sight of the dark Zapffe in Ved og Jevet. Stubber for Troms og Nordland. Wits and Witless, Stumps from Troms and Nordland, published in 1942, together with Einar K. AAS, in which one unmistakably finds the down-to-earth, astute northern Norwegian humor. It was Arthur Arnson who may have grasped part of the core of what this life full of contrasts was about, when he said about Zapffe, he who always felt so much attracted to the highest peaks may have come to understand high up there, and better than anyone else, that seriousness and gaiety, tragedy and comedy, melancholia and laughter are all part and parcel of what it means to be human. In his collection of essays Spok og Alver, Episler og Leiligetsvers, Jest and Earnest, epistles and occasional verse, both parts are present, as the title suggests, and even about seriousness Zapffe writes with a twinkle in his eye. It is first and foremost in his Barski Glieder that his sharp pen and humor come to their fullest expression. Barski Glieder could be regarded as one of the classic books on experiences in the outdoors, related to the tradition of travel accounts by Nansen, Amundsen, and Ingstad. An important aspect in Zapfe's writings is the importance of free, wild nature. On basis of this, some have argued that Zapffe thus should be regarded as the forebearer of modern-day deep ecology, of which Arne Næss, strictly speaking, was only a catalyst. This is of course open for discussion, as we soon will do, but let us first have a look at Zapfe's relation to Næss and to the radical nature conservation movement that started in the 1970s. In that context, I will also touch upon what Zapffe really meant with his concept of biosophy. Since 1993, Dag Olav Hessen is a professor in biology at the Department of Biosciences at the University of Oslo. He has published a large number of scientific works in ecology and evolution, and several books and other popular science works also in the cross-section of evolution, society, and philosophy. He is a dedicated mountaineer with a lifelong fascination for the works of Arne Næss and notably Peter Wessel Zapffe with his original existentialism rooted in biological arguments. At the end of the 1920s, shortly after he had moved from Tromsø to Oslo, student of law Peter Wessel Zapffe got acquainted with Arne Næss, who, already at that time displayed a striking self-confidence, talented as he was both as a climber and philosopher. The friendship between Næss and a 12 years older Zapffe was characterized by a mutual sense of admiration. Even though Næss in the course of time became a senior in the field, in a formal sense, and already was appointed professor when Zapffe still had to finish his doctoral thesis om det tragisk. Næss never concealed his deep admiration for Zapfe's analytical skill and brilliant use of language. However, the two had such different personalities that Zapffe eventually put an end to his friendship with Næss, whom, he thought, neither took life nor people seriously enough. Until then they had inspired each other through their engagement with both philosophy and mountaineering. And in the amusing tale, Barskig Leader, the reader can easily recognize Arne Næss as one of the key characters in the story. When one reads the at times rather witty and elegant, yet mostly prosaic correspondence that Zapffe and Næss maintained for over 50 years, from 1928 until 1978, one is struck by the fact that biosophy or ecology are hardly ever taken up as themes, or actually, not at all. So how important was Zapffe in Norway, in the context of efforts to advance nature conservation in general and deep ecology specifically? With respect to Zapfe's views on nature, biology, and ecology, one can distinguish three aspects, which are loosely related to each together. In the first place there is his biosophic method, which he practices in his dissertation om det tragisk. Then there is his more conventional engagement with the protection of nature. And lastly there is his possible contribution to the development of deep ecology. In order to maintain a chronological order and to adhere to what reason would dictate, it is natural to start with the intersection of biology and philosophy. The biological method. In brief, Zapfe's biological method, or biosophy, is based on the following reasoning. Humans, like all other living organisms, are confined by certain biological constraints, yet, according to Zapffe, they are also fundamentally unique. Although it counts for all living organisms that they strive for optimal biological operability, and, mostly, only that, humans stand out as an evolutionary wild card. We have developed an intellectual capacity that evolved way beyond what would be necessary from a biological point of view. The fear of boredom, or fear to be left with nothing but our own thoughts, a fear for fear itself, comes to expression in the need to fill our existence with rumble and noise of all sorts. The biosophic method thus becomes a kind of ecology that can help mankind to cope with that challenge, a challenge that requires a sophisticated answer, for it is so fundamentally at odds from the kind of direct challenges that other living beings, from amoeba to apes, face on their journey through life. The biosophic perspective, or biological method, is applied in most of Zapfe's theoretical publications. In om det tragisk, Zapffe indicates that he prefers using the term biological above biosophic, thinking about life, because biosophic has mystical connotations which wouldn't be appropriate in this context. In his later writings he uses the term biosophic more frequently. The difference between the two concepts is not clear, apart from the fact that biological implies something more empirical and less spiritual than biosophic. It is important to stress that Zapffe employs a biological or biosophic method, and not biosophy as such. It should thus be distinguished from Arne Næss's concept of eco-philosophy or Sigmund Kvoloi's notion of ecosophy, in which, in both cases, nature itself is the central theme. For Zapffe, biology and the living conditions of our species provide the backdrop, the source of metaphors and the analytical tools that we need on our journey through life. Despite Zapfe's strong environmental engagement and his view that humans are foreigners in nature, It is man's journey through life that really interests him. The aim of his anthropomorphism, the attribution of human forms or other characteristics to beings other than humans, of nature, which he brings to bear in Om det Tragisk, especially in the first 2 chapters, as well as in his animal fables, is to clarify why humans in general are so strongly inclined to use metaphors stemming from the animal world. It's not the animals themselves that are of interest here. Zapffe claims that animals have a calming effect on humans because, in the case of animals, an absolute harmony reigns between their capacities and their needs, in stark contrast with how the situation is for us, as humans. When an animal's needs for food and warmth are met to a satisfactory degree, it will attain a sense of happy peacefulness and carefree contentment. At that moment, the world is calm like a sea and there is nothing to be done. From times immemorial, humans have struggled to achieve such a peaceful state of mind in every possible way, through philosophizing and asceticism, through daydreaming, and through narcotics and war. Nature conservation. Parallel to his strong passion for being in the outdoors, and his sense of humor that went along with it, Zapffe also had a long-time commitment to the protection of nature, which came to expression in a continuous flow of publications criticizing the technification of nature. Even though his main focus was on the human condition, he felt a strong bond with untouched wilderness during the whole of his life. He was fervently against any human intervention in nature, be it the construction of roads, the erection of power lines, the spread of noise, and yes, even human presence in itself. His conservationist engagement was not completely free from elitist traits. Mountains should be closed off, they shouldn't be made widely accessible. With regard to his nature conservation activities and his engagement with other causes, he was deeply conservative in certain respects and radically progressive in others. Through his commitment to nature conservation, he saw human beings as foreign elements and stated that the earth wouldn't necessarily be worse off without humans. When he stated that it would be better for humankind to die out, either by abstaining from conceiving children, like he himself had done, or at least by having not more than only one child, he didn't declare this because he saw humans as a menace to nature, but because life couldn't supply the sense of purpose and justness that Zapffe was craving for. In Zapfe's Barski Glider there are 2 classic essays on the protection of nature, Avskjed med Galsta, Parting with Galsta. Galsta is an iconic Norwegian mountain, and Farvel Norge, Farewell Norway. Parting with Galsta can be considered as one of the first strong condemnations of Norway's conquest of nature, written in a period when the belief in the merits of technology and progress still largely went unquestioned. Farewell Norway is a funny interview full of mockery that the writer conducts with himself, or rather with his alter ego, Jorgen, the old man of the mountain. The interviewer is a rather naive journalist, a strong adherent of the idea of progress, who wants to hear Jorgen's opinion on how the mountains can best be opened up to as many people as possible. Jorgen reacts furiously when confronted with this issue, firing one shot after the other. I am talking about the whole filthification of Norway. We have already desecrated the most beautiful places to make room for foreign exchange factories, mountains resorts. Concrete boxes called Sunny Crest and Shady Glade to entice asphalt gypsies who will soon find out that Sunny Crest is really a parking lot and that the rural fresh air comes from overflowing waste disposal units at the hotels down below, while at the same time, higher up, the silver is collected. Or in more general terms, today the total weight of the Norwegian population is 220.000 tons. In this country, the only commonly shared goal is to increase, double, or quadruple the amount of people. The God of our times is called multiplier. He is omnipotent and omnipresent. He guarantees that 6 times 5 is 30, irrespective of whether this amounts to shit or to lilies. Each and every new cradle is a temple in his honor. Rows of houses with rows of people, apartment blocks with blocks of people, mass production of efficient people. In a world of mathematicians, nobody bothers to ask what all these numbers are supposed to mean. Farewell Norway can thus be seen as the quintessence of Zapfe's skeptical views on progress. Progress only stands for more of everything, an avalanche that covers up mountains. As early as 1934, in his essay Fjell that I Fear, Mountains in Danger, Zapffe ventilated his objections against making the mountains more accessible. In this essay he criticizes the Norwegian Tourist Association for its efforts to open the highlands. Once there are signs, the character of a mountain area changes fundamentally. It's like the difference between a virgin and a whore. When we go to the mountains, it is because we want to get away from this rationalized, economic and man-made world in which we are forced to live, and we do not want to be confronted with it in any new way or, God forbid, in any familiar way. What we are looking for is absolute silence, the one that you can only find in wilderness. That's why it is the first signpost that is devastating, not the 20th or 30th. Another critical essay by Zapffe on the destruction of nature is Veien, the Road, 1952. It poetically describes a path that gently winds its way past roots and rocks, and that even after its transformation into a dirt road that is fringed with wild flowers continues to maintain its organic relations with its surroundings. Then something radically changes. People planned to build a new hotel in the valley. The engineers came. Strange men with iron rods, T-squares and eyes of quartz with which they could see the beams. They yelled and they dug, and with a lot of roar and smoke they tore a broad and bleeding sore in the rock, right through the valley. The new road went berserk, blind and deaf to everything except reaching its final goal. Zapffe wanted to save the Norwegians from Die Norwegische Landschaft. Zapffe is keen to use the German language here. For him it stands for a kind of landscape on which humans and their technological operations have an ever greater impact, and he wanted to see to it that in defense of pristine nature not even red T's would be painted on rocks, to thus mark a mountain trail. Does this represent an argument against humanity? No, Zapffe is not a radical deep ecologist. He is keen to retain wilderness for the sake of us, humans, because it serves as a way to connect to our inner life and as an arena for our Dionysian life cravings. Humans are welcome in wilderness areas on the condition that we leave no traces behind, and there shouldn't be too many of us at the same time. Undeniably, there is an elitist element in Zapfe's reasoning. The mountains shouldn't be made accessible for hordes of people demanding roads and comfort. Rather, access should be allowed to those few people who deserve it, because of their own strenuous efforts, because they are able to truly appreciate the mountains as they are, and because they manage to sit quietly on a mountain top, from where they can look down at all the hustle and bustle down in the valleys. His critique of society is mainly built on the view that, due to city life and mass tourism, we are robbed of the deep experience of the silence in nature, and we no longer have the ability to reflect upon that fundamental burning question, what it means to be human. Zapfe's critique of the technification and the ever further dispersal of an upper landschaft partly stems from his critical stance against development, or rather, development that aims to subjugate nature, to erase the last blank spots on the map. In that respect, polar expeditions conducted with airplanes were a curse to him, and to make her accessible or to exploit her. There is a classic line that Zapffe was fond of quoting, and it goes like this: "Way too few people enjoy the peacefulness of Ornedalen." Once the ring road is there, this is bound to change. The main problem with all this opening up of the landscape and making it widely accessible, in his view, is that it diminishes possibilities for people to experience it in a deep way, and this, ultimately, is more of an anthropocentric than a biocentric concern for Zapffe. He isn't a deep ecologist in the sense of all life is sacred. One of his letters to Arne Næss, a letter dated Jagervatnet, August 26, 1939, opens as follows: "Dear friend, here I find myself again sitting underneath the mountain tops, like a fox under a rowan tree. They rise up high and have become tarnished. Just a small trip, a so-called first ascent, the kind you would ignore," and he ends the letter by referring to a review he has read of Albert Schweitzer's life's philosophy and the latter's principle that all life is sacred. Zapffe is not really impressed by this principle. Schweitzer is, at a quick glance, a complete joke. Veneratio vitae, the golden, metaphysical moral principle, sacred and inviolable. All good and well, but then comes along an angry dog, or some cholera bacteria or a dandelion in a rose bed, then what? Yes, then we are allowed to kill them, we just have to. Have you ever heard of such a thing? When I came upon this part, I put the book aside, and went out to work in the forest. One could argue that although Zapffe was radical in many ways in his critique of society, in other ways he was also a typical, rather classic conservative, no unusual combination, and this can also be traced in his use of language. He was particular about applying the correct rules of spelling, precisely as he had learned them at school. Deep ecology. In deep ecology, humans are seen as a part of nature, not having a higher moral position than other life forms. In contrast, Zapffe highlights the fundamental differences between humans and other life. For it is only our species that is equipped with an overdeveloped and dysfunctional ability to consciousness. As he argues in a later text, entitled Biosophisk Efterschrift, Biosophic Epilogue, at some point during the millions of years of evolution, among a myriad of bigger and smaller differentiations, a division took place which split the animal kingdom in two, with animals on one side and the human species on the other. Nevertheless, Zapffe also speaks of a common destiny for all life. In part, this common destiny is grounded in the fact that there is more to life than merely fulfilling the need of reproduction. Humans have still not grasped any higher meaning in the blind and purposeless relay race of one generation taking over from the previous. Another aspect of this common destiny, however, is that all life is at the mercy of the blind and unpredictable forces of the universe. Storms, fires, droughts, colds, meteor impacts, all life will be impacted by the same absolute and blind factor of chance, whether one is schooled or unschooled, amoeba or dictator. We are all given a temporary residence here, and it can be revoked at any time. Hence, Zapfe's main concern is humanity, and his view that humans should refrain from reproducing themselves comes forth from his reflections on our own situation, not from his concern for the planet. There is no doubt, however, that his criticism of the hedonistic, anti-intellectual consumer society, of the catastrophic race forevermore without reflecting on the why, of the fragmentation of nature, and of the commercialization of the mountains, has resonated widely with persons who were about to take central positions in the Norwegian environmental movement in general and in mountain philosophy. In particular, Sigmund Kvoloy, later Seatrain, Arne Næss, Erik de Man, Nils Farlund, and Ivar Misterud. Sigmund Kvoloy's Seatrain particularly was deeply inspired by Zapfe's critique of society. He developed it further through initiating an activist environmental movement, with the cryptic name, SNM, always written in brackets. SNM stands for Samarbeidsudvalget for Natur og Miljøvern, the Cooperative Organization for Nature and Environmental Protection. Clearly, Kvoloy Seatrain himself regarded Zapffe as a major source of inspiration, as demonstrated for instance in his epilogue in an anthology of Zapfe's writings entitled Essays, published in 1992. Arne Næss was also influenced by Zapfe's criticism of the growth society, a point of view that gained momentum and was more widely embraced during the 1960s. In 1972, Arne Næss first coined the term deep ecology. It was based on the viewpoint that formal ecology, above all a science-based, rationalistic and analytic ecology, was not capable of engaging with that dimension of nature that affects human feelings of identification and empathy. Deep ecology can act as some kind of complement, where feelings are considered legitimate and important factors. The concept is related to an attitude towards nature that comes to expression in the slogan, La Elva Live, let the river live. This is a deep, yet difficult to define feeling, because everything in nature has value, and we humans are part of this whole. Zapffe would have said yes to La Elva Live, but would maybe have been more skeptical about the idea that all life is sacred. Whether Zapffe indeed played the key role in Norwegian eco-philosophy or deep ecology, as some people have claimed, remains open to contest and, as said before, his biosophic method should not be confused with some of the concepts that were developed at a later instance, such as biosophy or ecosophy. However, no one would deny that Zapffe has been very influential, as was demonstrated recently, rather compellingly, in the book Arvin O.G. Gledden, ETT Festskrift till Naturen, Heritage and Joy, a Jubilee edition for nature. 2010, the book was published by the Council for Eco-Philosophy, chaired by Borge Dahl and Nils Farlund. And it contains the so-called Stedender-Claren-Gen Declaration of Stedend on Sustainable Development, as well as many contributions, amongst others by myself, in which reference is made to Zappfe's ideas. Stedend was really his mountain and a symbol for the eternal sovereignty of the minerals. Perhaps the typical mountain eco-philosophy, of which Zapffe was the forefather, can be characterized by the slogan, having a rich life with simple means. These were Arne Næss's words, but they would also have fitted Zapffe very well, just as they would fit many of us. It partly entails the protection of mountains and nature as such, but it also means the preservation of mountains as locus for a life of voluntary simplicity that leaves space for unbound thinking, including the kind of thinking that led Zapffe to formulate his philosophy. But let us not make a too theoretical analysis when we explore Zapfe's love for nature. It's to be found in, or shines through, most of his essays in Barski Glider. It takes struggle, facing the freezing cold and plowing through the endless deep snow to make one's way up to Pigton Mountain, but what ultimately counts is the freedom and joy, and a little glimpse of what, ultimately, constitutes the meaning of life.